Hello, I'm Alex Totaro.
And I'm Alex Goldstein.
We're a couple of TV nerds with opinions, and this is The Thing That Gets You to the Thing, a Halt and Catch Fire fan podcast.
This week, we're on season 1, episode 4, called Close to the Metal, which means we're getting under Donna's skin via writer Jonathan Lisco and director Johan Renck, who aficionados of 90s music might know under another name. More of that in a moment.
You know the drill by now. We're rewatching episode by episode on Amazon Prime, and we think you should do too.
Okay, then. Here we go to the Temple of Construction. So let me explain that little segue there.
Should I slice in some 90s music here to confuse
You
everyone, or
do
what are
need
we
to
doing?
slice in some 90s music there if you can. So Johan Renck, it turns out, having done a little Googling, little Wikipediaing, was known in the 90s as Swedish DJ and dance music sensation Stakka Bo,
Okay.
whose big breakout hit in the UK, and I'm sure that he had more hits in other places, but the one that I know him for was Here We Go, which has that little refrain, Here we go, 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 to the Temple of Consumption, which is very Joe as well. So it all seems to come together beautifully. So yeah, we have a new director and a new writer on board for this episode again. So another movement away from what we had last week. Jonathan Lisco had a little look at his credits before Halt and Catch Fire, and they included NYPD Blue and Southland.
Okay.
Can't claim to have watched any Southland. Have watched a bit of NYPD Blue, but it's been a really long time, so I'm not sure if I can draw any sensible connections between that and Halt and Catch Fire. But I'm definitely seeing a new visual approach here.
Yeah, and I think it's quite exciting actually now that we get into the different directors to have so much diverse talent behind the camera in terms of different styles. I mean, you're telling me that this week we had like a Swedish DJ, which is amazing, and actually, in a way, making up for maybe the lack of new talent on screen and different ways to position our characters.
It's what's interesting is we talked last week about how we're suddenly having a bunch of new, possibly recurring characters you would expect to see again, right? So, like Donna's mum and her boss, and actually they're barely present in this episode at all. The only new character is the journalist, who you know you're only going to see for one episode. Like that's set up nice and clear. So we're back to the heartland again. We're back to these four people interacting, but with this new visual and I think a new writing approach as well. We'll go into those in detail in a bit.
Yeah, and I've texted you how much more I've enjoyed this episode versus the previous one. I was like, yes, this is a return to form to an extent. Like we'll dive into some of the problematic. We've already talked about season one not being perfect, and it
Yeah.
won't be. And every episode has its quirks, but I do think, and again, it might be because we're back to following sort of our main cast of characters, and actually, for in my opinion, a really compelling obstacle this episode that actually could put more than one thing at risk. Now, we're talking about a show setting up storylines for character development on top of building the new computer, where we're led to believe that like the entire season will somehow sort of lead up to that moment with references to like when we're presenting a comdex, or how soon can you get this ready, or the IBM lawyers, whatever those references are. So I do really think that the way they play around with mixing those sort of storylines but continue to be grounded on developing the thing is actually something that hopefully we get to see more of, and how those two worlds collide. Because again, last week it felt a bit disconnected.
I liked last week's more than you did, but last week's was a kind of character study, right? Everything was just about pecking order. There was no particular plot beat or urgency to it. It was just people working out their dynamics to each other. And I like that, but I can see very quickly how lots of episodes of that would just get too messy too quickly. Like there was just a bit um there was a lot going on without anything really happening, which was not great for the third episode of a show that you want people to feel a sense of momentum about. I had misgivings about this episode
Mm-hmm.
to do with some of the ways that the characters interact and some of the writing. But I can't deny that it absolutely, like, the structure is back. You have a very strong sense of the point of what's happening here.
Yeah.
Like you say, they start dropping some hints about timeline, right? They start building the urgency into, like, up until now, you've been mostly interested in these characters, but let's not forget we've got a product and a timeline and a specific world in which to do.
And things around that, right? Like, it's just because Joe put out his vision, put people in a room, and then managed to try and get some funding doesn't mean that that's it. And we'll find out that actually some of the funding elements are things that actually get in the way, sort of in Joe's world, as he continues to sort of, in a way, also distance himself from the rest of the characters,
Yeah.
yet still have an active part in manipulating all of them, which is quite an accomplishment.
I mean, really, he spends an awful lot of this episode not talking to anyone other than the journalist and Boz, and sequestered away in his office, or they're bugging the journalist. And the only person, and we will certainly get back to this later, but the only person with whom he has any kind of like significant standoff is Donna, and that's the very first time that happens. So up until now, they've had a scant handful of exchanges on the phone at a distance. Just that time she came into the garage and just shut him down and sent him out. And it's never been more than about 2 sentences. And now they have a proper standoff in his office. Um, and that's a fascinating scene. But to backtrack slightly to what we said about the visuals, the strong sort of thing that, so if the last episode we saw some quick fire editing, we saw some of those off kilter but quite static scenes,
Movements, yeah.
lots of very close but very still camera work. Here, I almost felt queasy. Like, some of this is, I assume, handheld. Like, if it isn't, it's certainly designed to look like it.
Yeah.
Really quick fire editing. Like, there's a lot of movement going on here all of a sudden behind the camera, which I don't think I've seen before at all in the show.
I think it helps with the sort of subject matter of the episode. We're talking about a sort of fire burning on two sides, right? On the Cameron side of things in terms of the bios, but also on the journalist being there for that one day to sort of capture the story. So it's almost the sort of line on lit up on an explosive before it detonates, isn't it? And
Yeah, like a cartoon where Wile E. Coyote is like, "I'm setting fire to the end of this dynamite."
and you got boss with the TNT lever.
Fanning.
Exactly. And I think that sort of plays into that. I think that's a really good observation in relation to that. And again, when you look at stills from the show, right? Let's take away the element of watching an episode. The episodes have that look and consistency, which I love because again, we've said it countless times. It gets sort of established from day one in episode one. But one of the things that I really enjoyed about what they continue to experiment with on some of the camera work, but in the directing, but also in this episode, they really play with the lighting, not in ways that we've seen before. It's not necessarily like, look at this angelic light on Cameron's hair, but actually, it's a very dark episode. It's a very sort of warm, low lighting, dim lights. I mean, we're talking about characters that are holed up in one room or another. We're talking about a lot of sort of um, processing and thinking that is going on by these characters, and obviously a lot of late nights. So um, it was interesting to see. Well, I'm jumping around a little bit, but when Cameron sort of goes out into the terrace of the rooftop of Cardiff Electric, and she's having that moment again, it's kind of like she's breathing again. Whenever we see her, it's either in the dungeon or outside in broad daylight, and I think the for a show that is so rooted in symbolism, you would have thought that her running outside would be like in the middle of the storm because if there's a storm inside, why wouldn't things be getting destroyed? And she could have seen a tornado at a distance. I mean, this is Texas, and it's not that. It's like broad daylight. The world is continuing outside, and she just needs to breathe. And so, I do appreciate when they draw the line there. But I think the lighting has been an amazing part of the show, and sort of allows certain places to be highlighted in certain ways. Like we know that Cardiff Electric as a whole is very sort of white lighting, very cool, corporate, sort of harsh. And then you go to Cameron's sort of corner, and you know it helps. The darkness helps put sort of distance between her and others.
Yeah, and she gets a kind of the kind of green and blue treatment. She gets a sort of subterranean look that's entirely her own, and that kind of flips when she goes outside because everything then becomes very pale and brilliant and washed out.
And it follows her because when she breaks into Gordon and Donna's house, that look followed her. That lighting.
Yes. Yeah, because that lighting has not is not typical of their home environment, which is much warmer and more yellow.
And we've never seen that house empty. And in even in later episodes, you don't see that kind of look. So it does sort of follow her around, which I think is a really sort of interesting thing to see as it sort of develops. But let's go back to the story for a second before
Hmm.
we dive deeper into it, because I feel like the camera work and the lighting in this episode, whilst it is established throughout the whole episode and it's consistent, I feel like it has moments again, like Cameron going into the house, or
Mhm.
her breathing, or you know, Boss. Actually, Boss is another character that tends to be surrounded in either broad daylight or very very dim lighting in his office. Anytime someone goes into his office, the curtains are drawn. It tends to be lit by sort of warm desk lamps. It's kind of an interesting situation there. Actually, are they trying to tell us something?
There's an interesting sense in which Boz has been very isolated from the people doing the job up until now. So he's been in the, his desk is in the back corner of this office that couldn't really be much further away from the kind of washed out, bright, intense cubicles of the floor in which Gordon has been living all this time. And you've got Boz in a sort of, if Cameron's dungeon is sort of green and subterranean and a bit sort of a bit punky like her,
Yeah,
like a
yeah,
bit
yeah.
alternative and choosing to be removed from the crowd. Boz's is somebody who has insulated himself with money. Like his room kind of screams wealth, the kind of 80s paneled walls. Like if there were
Sure.
ever a hint of Dallas in the show, it's in Boz's office
Yeah,
with the long kind of blinds and all the rest
he's
of it.
the
And
man.
he's built a wall for himself out of the money that he has made this company. And the more that he's losing his grip on that role, the more people kind of burst into his office and spend more time in there. Joe has his sort of fundraising meetings in there. Cameron wanders in at night with the shoes. It's like his office has been this sort of insulated sanctuary for as long as Cardiff was functioning in the old-fashioned traditional ways. And now that
Mm.
the new wave's coming through, it gets broken open, and you see it as quite a claustrophobic space, despite the fact that he has more room in that building than anyone else. Like he has more physical space, but it feels really tight and dark and really, and once, I mean, now we know that he sleeps in that office as well. It's sort of the walls are closing in.
Yeah, actually, that's a really good point, and we touched on this a bit on the last episode. But I do love how the camera work allows us to either get a fixed view on a certain place, and that happens a lot in Gordon and Donna's house, for example, or a view around some of the elements. It's kind of like those films that, and I don't know why I can't think of a single director at the moment. I'm sure Yorgos has done this, where the camera goes around and around and around the same space, and you're looking at the same thing, but actually there's one thing that's off. It feels very Wes Anderson as well, where the way that the scenes are set up make it so that in plain sight you're looking at something, but in detail it's been in front of you all along. And I feel like Boss's office is kind of that, without going too deep into the conspiracy theories. Well,
No, I would totally agree that there's something kind of very specific about that lens that they want you to think about when you are with Boz. And Boz, so some interesting things happen to Boz in this episode. It obviously opens with him. He's still struggling with the ramifications of who is in charge and who's doing what after the fallout with Lulu.
Yeah.
And what's interesting in the writing is that you've got a writer who's obviously very, very aware of how heavy symbolism is in the show and
Yeah.
chooses to write it in as a deliberate self-aware act. So there is no way that Nathan choosing to speak to Boz at
Yeah.
this point in time in front of the horse that's kind of outlived its usefulness is an accident. Like it's almost like Nathan's been watching the show and he's gone, you know what we need right here is a symbol. And it's a beautiful symbol of Nathan as well, because he literally says he wants to pull strings without getting his hands dirty, and he's not the one that does the shooting either.
No.
So, he just sits back and lets all this stuff happen. He orchestrates it, but he doesn't want to touch anything. And that opening, and then towards the end of the show, this massive symbolic beating that Joe takes, that I guess you're supposed to think Boz set up. Like, it feels like you're being led to think that he did, but it just I don't know whether
really
I'm sort of I don't know whether my thoughts are colored by the fact that I know a little bit about, like, I remember a bit about where Boz's character development is going to go, and I don't want to tread down that path because obviously some people will not have seen it before.
No.
It just doesn't feel right on anything that we know about him already. We know that he's crotchety, we know that he's defensive, we know that he'll spike a deal if it doesn't feel appropriate to him. But we also know he gets his hands dirty, he picks up the phone, he feels for the people in the office, like,
he'll deliver
yeah.
in
And
your hands.
He told off Cameron for, like, being disrespectful about the memory of somebody who's been let go, effectively.
Yeah.
They're not dead, they've just been fired, which is obviously really significant. And he had a sort of feeling that it was inappropriate and ungentlemanly to do that. And yet, is he really willing to orchestrate a beat? Unless you're supposed to think that Nathan's done it and Boz is just there to tidy it up. That was the ambiguity I wasn't sure about.
So looking back and thinking back about this, I mean, it was weird to me that Boss was picking him up because they have a relationship, but I wouldn't say it's. I mean, I would have thought he would have called Cameron or I mean, although he was ashamed, right? That was probably like a pride thing.
See, I thought that he can't afford to lose his status with any of the other three. Like,
Sure.
Donna, he'd never call anyway because they have no relationship.
But
Cameron,
that's exactly I feel like
yeah.
why he'd like, knowing what we know about those two. I feel like maybe if it was a case of like, I know you won't say anything because we have no relationship. I don't know. I mean, but you're right. But the show,
I think he doesn't know whether Donna will tell Gordon anything, and actually it turns out Donna will tell Gordon when she discovers something. So he doesn't know if he can trust her yet. He doesn't know. He can't afford to look too pathetic in front of Gordon.
No.
And with Cameron, like, their relationship is so weird still, whether they have so many different strands to their relationship. So it does make sense to me that he would. And also, Boz is the one most likely to have the money to bail someone out.
And it's probably on the corporate money, on the corporate card. But the thing the thing on that one, and you touched on something really interesting, is that the show likes drawing parallels constantly. That's how most episodes are set up. Joe wakes up, Donna and Gordon wake up, and Cameron wakes up. Like, we are constantly being shown these parallels between these different characters and what they're going through at similar times.
How they
life and
how they address the same thing in different ways. Like,
pretty
we're
much
shown that constantly.
And so, if you think about Joe orchestrating this entire situation with Donna or with Cameron more than with Donna, sorry, and the journalist, why wouldn't we assume that Nathan had this done? But again, mixed signals, because Boss once told Joe, if you fuck this up, I'm gonna go all Texas on you. And is this what all Texas means? But also, we have just seen Joe be with a guy. And so are we led to believe that it's a whole 80s sort of, you're homosexual, we think, so we're going to beat you up? I don't know.
Well, it definitely has shades of horrific gay bashing. Like, it has those, especially because it's cops that deliver it, right?
Exactly.
So it has that sense of authority figures will find the kind of chink in your armor and abuse it. And Boz was a little bit like he had a bit of a weird reaction once he started, like once the wheels started to turn when in the previous episode where Joe's sitting in the car and he's like, wait a minute, what did you do? And it starts to occur to him. So you're like, did he have an old fashioned kind of, I say old fashioned, it's not like it doesn't still happen, but did he have a kind of homophobic reaction to Joe? Is this him going, look, Nathan's threatening me, so I have to threaten Joe? Is it Nathan showing him the way to go, like, Boz, if you want this to work, you're going to have to be prepared to do things like this? Like, it never really gets unpicked enough, and you're left with this ambiguity of like, is Boz meting out the punishment and also doing the cleanup, or is he just accepting that, oh man, it's like this? People like Nathan run the world. We're the guys who get threatened with shooting and beaten up. Like, I genuinely don't know, and it left me feeling like so much in this episode is spelled out. Like, why would you leave this one thing ambiguous?
No, I know. And again, boss sort of greeting the policeman as if he knew them and like, how's your kid, whatever. And like, I get it. It's a small, we're told time and time again, like, you're in Texas, this is my land, Silicon Prairie, we know everyone and we get around. And I've said this before, I did not remember sort of this rivalry being set up between Boss and Joe, because
Mm.
I don't remember their relationship evolving like that. But and even watching the show now, it's because Boss is so much his own man. Like, he's not reading up on how to code so he can be a Joe. He's reading up on it because he wants to generally move the company forward by piggybacking off Joe's vision. He's not making moves against them. He's not making moves with him either, in a way. So to me, it feels really odd that they would choose to do this scene. I mean, it's the scar thing again, right? It's the, are you
Yeah.
setting something up that we're meant to believe but aren't quite sure?
Yeah. And what's I think the other reason that the ambiguity bothered me is because in this particular episode we have an interaction where the ambiguity is just ripped away. So we've talked a lot about how in the first couple of episodes there were hints of discussion about feminism, and then in the previous episode there was the way that Joe's revelation about his sexuality was handled, both in quite matter of fact ways. And then we have, and it's probably time to talk about Donna now in some detail, but then we have Donna's first meeting with Cameron. And Cameron says to her, "Who are you anyway? Just somebody's mother?" And they literally have that like feminism 101 conversation of, "Oh,
Yes.
you are mother. Oh, you are slut." And it's just
And a
like,
child.
why are we having this? Why are we having this right now? And it almost feels like the writers are like, you know what? This is going to come up at some point. So let's just have the conversation, get it out of the way, move on with our lives. And then we can have this. They need Donna and Cameron to have some sort of
Caddy.
explosion at each other because we know that Donna's uncomfortable with Cameron. We don't really know why. We get the sense that even though she's like, well, you slept your way to the top, that's actually probably not what's bothering her. You get the sense that what's bothering her is that there's a woman in there doing the work and it's not her. Uh, so, because finally she's happy. This is the first time we see Donna happy while she's working. Like, we haven't seen her unquestionably happy in 3.5 episodes. And then suddenly we're like, oh my God, that's a real smile.
Let's jump into Donna. So I already told you I have this theory while sort of analyzing the episodes, that every episode is centered on a different character. So
Mhm.
this feels like the Donna episode, and I feel like more
Definitely.
so than even overshadows Joe's schemes. I think because Donna, first of all, everything we've been saying about Donna in terms of like how good is she, does she know this world, is absolutely true. And the guys say it when they're trying to solve this issue of like how do they get around these burnt discs. It's like, Gordon, your wife is smarter than you. And he's like, well, yeah, that's why I married her. It's like, shut up, Gordon. But yes, Donna's way smarter than
Even when
you.
Gordon gives her credit, he's still the worst because every time he then undermines it. It's like, your wife's smarter than you. That's why I married her because I'm really clever and I made this
Yeah, I
decision.
chose
And
it.
then he defends her and he's like, Donna's the only person who could do this. But it's about the work, not about Donna. It's about, look, we need this problem solved. And then later, he's the very first one to step in and give her her fake name which is her mother's name, which just kind of makes it even more like, really? That's as far as you could get?
And I understand why that happened. To be honest with you, I mean, it's a shame that Donna didn't have a say on that in this matter. But the thing that fascinated me about Donna is that not only does she understand the world, not only is she, very very clever and smart, is she actually went to a good university and has had like accolades for her work. Like she's like, I did my dissertation on this, and you're like, whoa, whoa, okay, you're not just someone interested in tech that can do it. Like you're not a Cameron to another level. So for me, this episode really drew a lot of parallels between Donna and Cameron from a point of view of Donna, mother, mature person, life experience to an extent, and then okay, as we've been told by her mother, she could have been in Canada or Rome, and Cameron basically spoiled brat, but not a spoiled brat from a point of view of she's had it all, but rather an attitude towards like everything belongs to me and I'm a petty child, a child,
It's
and
a
so
toddler. It's a the world revolves around me, not because I've been given everything, but just because I'm right.
exactly. And when Donna is telling her why she's so qualified for this, she is once again showing that a mature way out of the situation and like really taking it seriously and almost being very Donna from like giving her advice. And I'm not just talking about the end, but rather throughout. It's just kind of like, even though she's getting insulted by this child that she doesn't know and is clearly like having a panic attack, she's still like, back him up, or the comment about sleeping with Joe. I mean, I generally think Donna was like, don't do that, like that's not how you get around,
It doesn't do you any good as a woman.
even though she is throwing some catty stuff around. But I feel like Donna is positioning her a step above, to the point where one, she's the only one that figured out Joe's little plan. Two, when she goes and confronts Joe, the reason he's kind of confiding in her is because he recognizes a certain level of that neither Cameron or Gordon can match from
So
that point of view.
it's fascinating that it is always women that call Joe on his bullshit. Even Lulu did it. Like he got around her, but even she did it. Cameron on the scars. Now Donna on this whole charade with the journalist. But what's fascinating about like when it came to Lulu, Joe just didn't give a damn, but she was still trying to charm him. And when it comes to Cameron, they show on and off a certain amount of gentleness to each other. Like they let their guard down in different ways and they have this close physical relationship. With Donna and Joe in that showdown, what becomes very, very clear, and it'll be fascinating to see if they maintain this. What becomes very clear is they have no interest in charming each other. They have no interest in winning each other over. Like when he challenges her being in the office, it's not like when Cameron does it, she takes the time to like spell out her creds to Cameron and be like, I deserve to be here because this, because it's another woman. And she's like, they have that awkward conversation, which I don't love, but at least the thing that runs underneath it is like, we both know that it's difficult for women in this space. When Joe challenges her being in there, she's like ready to throw up her hands and be like, right now, I'm not allowed in the building. Like, F you then. And she's like ready to walk because she has no time for this shit.
No, she's there out of like another Gordon desperate attempt. Like even when Gordon's not even that prevalent in this episode, he still manages to not approach things in the right way. He sort of like leaves the girls hanging last minute. He doesn't take ownership. Again, it's like, Gordon, if you're not happy, you can't function as a human being, and that really annoys me about him.
And when she says that pivotal line that I think the entire episode is about, I make your world possible, she's not just talking about at home. She's talking about literally everywhere she goes. She bailed him out of jail in the first episode. She's bailing Cameron out of jail metaphorically in this episode. Everywhere she goes, she's fucking cleaning up somebody's mess because she is everyone's mum and she's sick of it.
And she's just had to kill a bird, and she's doing,
Oh my
and
god.
she's failing at work.
She's failing in the one place where she's on her own and should be able to do it because in this world there are no kids, there is no husband, she should be able to really excel in this one space, but she can't because the demands of being everyone's mom, including Gordon's, are just pulling her down.
And indirectly, in the last episode, when after she saw the physics problem around this revolutionary concept of what if you folded the motherboard and some of those components, and Gordon goes to present it, the guy's like, come on, Gordon, like, you think the factories are gonna just create something custom for us? And like, even that indirectly is dragging Donna's ideas down the drain. And we saw in the beginning of the episode where she was asking, like, she was suggesting to redesign something that was clearly not functioning. And what I don't like about her situation at work is that she almost gets insulted from her boss without giving a chance to sort of redeem herself.
And the thing is that I do have this question in my head about whether Donna is kind of the writer's favorite, and I'll justify that. Donna represents hardware and engineering, right? She represents stuff you can touch, stuff you can look at. Yes, she's trying to get Cameron's coding work, but ultimately she's trying to move a physical thing. And you can see that she very much believes in the structure and the foundations, because if she didn't do that, then none of this other flashy pants stuff that gets all the attention could exist, right? It only exists because people like her have created the infrastructure for it to exist. And in that kind of, it almost felt like in that conversation where her and Cameron were pushing and pulling on it, and yes, they were having this really tired conversation about female archetypes, and I still think that could have been handled with a bit more delicacy. But they're really just a proxy for what they think they do in the world. Like, Cameron thinks that she provides kind of excitement and vision and a reason to live in the world, right? Like, her relationship with Joe is like pleasure and physical sensation and the reason to be alive. And Donna is like, I am the building blocks. Without me pushing the kid out, you got nothing. You've got no next generation if people like me don't do the work. And I almost think that I don't know, I'm totally projecting onto Jonathan Lisco here, but I've definitely worked in places where there is a tension between writers and designers, right? Writers and artists. Now, I'm married to a designer, no tension, love him. But you get this in workplaces all the time where you're like, you get the kind of stereotypes of, oh, the writer's written something and then the designer has just like gone, yeah, I don't want any words. I'm just going to crap out all the words and put, here's a 1-inch space for you to put your 3 paragraphs. Thanks. And then vice versa, you get issues with the designer being like, how on earth does any writer think that you're going to communicate all this in this space? It's impossible.
And it happens with any dependencies on any discipline.
Yeah.
I mean, I get this with creatives all the time. I say, I created this. It's like, oh, look at this amazing idea, but the execution on certain platforms can't work, or anything that requires this level, this dynamic. And actually, going back to your point for a second around Donna being the mastermind, let's just call it for like hardware, and Cameron sort of undermining herself on the software side, because the irony is that literally Donna makes her world possible now, because Cameron can't do her revolutionary computer software without proper hardware, which Donna is building. It's not Gordon, it's not Joe that's going to give it to her. And I think what actually the penny's starting to drop, that Cameron's problems are not just limited by her not being able to solve this issue, is she wants to race before she can walk, and Gordon can't match that from a hardware point of view. So is Donna suddenly that fourth pillar that we talked about being the balancing act? Because we've seen Donna not only be clever and smart, but also very rational and mature. And so when you have Cameron saying like, oh, what are you, somebody's mom? It's like the irony that the girls that she's raising are exactly the people whose generation are going to push boundaries forward like you want them to.
And it's definitely not an accident that Cameron relates to children and actually talks to the children in a much warmer and more pleasant way. Like, we've talked before about her feeling like she can let her guard down around people who aren't challenging her work. So she can be a bit more pleasant to the random people that she finds on the street. She can be a bit more pleasant to Boz when he's just like trying to understand but not trying to take over. She's definitely more pleasant to the kids. And then there's that, I mean, I found the kids going, Mommy and Daddy say you are trash. A bit like, really? Nah. Like, I get there had to be...
And laughing.
Yeah. I get there had to be an inciting episode to get her into their house, but that just felt... That was clumsy. I did not enjoy that.
So that was clumsy. Her breaking into the house was clumsy. The one piece of continuity that I do enjoy is sort of the neighbor being slash ex-employee that Gordon fired, both in the beginning of the episode and when Cameron's in there, because I do like that they didn't just drop it as someone else. It's just like he still lives next to them, right? They've sort of set up this sort of like perfect world where they live in the suburbs and everyone knows each other, blah, 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 blah. I want to go back on what are your points that you made around the way that that scene was written, the last, well, the couple of big exchanges between Donna and Cameron, because I agree with you, and this reminded me why I hated Cameron in season one. If I didn't say this enough last episode, this episode certainly is like, oh, I can't stand you. You are a fucking child, but also more than that, you're a cliche. She misguidedly was written like that, I think. But Donna doesn't put up with it from that point of view. And so it could have been a cat fight, excuse the terminology, but it wasn't. And so I think there was a shimmer of maybe this being on purpose, even though we know that it could have been better. But
Oh, yeah, I think it's deliberate. I do think it's deliberate, and I think it's meant to do a good thing. I think it's meant to go, look, here is the conversation you were expecting, but underneath there's a different conversation going on. There's a different conversation about visions and worldview and where they see themselves in the world. I still found the execution a bit hokey. I couldn't 100% get on board with it.
and I think a lot of things are still meant to be for dramatic sort of impact, because a lot of times in this show, dramatic moments will come from words and actions like this, not necessarily even when in the last episode there was a car crash. Like we all know, we love TV. We know that the best season finale is a car crash when you don't know if the character survived. I'm looking at you, Dead to Me season two. Oh, sorry, you don't. You haven't. I don't know if you've seen that season yet. Have you seen it?
I've seen the end. Yeah,
Oh,
sorry guys. If you haven't seen the end of Dead to Me season 2, there's a car crash. We're not going to tell you who's in it, but there is a car crash.
yeah, we're not gonna tell you who's in it, but like we know like a car flipping, a car crash, and blah blah blah.
A shooting, a thing. I mean, like the classic end of the first season of The West Wing, where there's a big shooting and you have absolutely no idea who's down. And
Riverdale, remember Riverdale when it was good for like 3 episodes?
oh yeah, remember when anyone cared about that?
It can be done, and that's fine. But what I'm trying to say is that in this show, those moments don't define those dramatic moments. It's more about like, will this character show up? Will that other person be able to handle the pressure to get something else going? And I feel like that's where the writing becomes the biggest weapon to an extent, because you're not talking about a dramatic scene that actually involves camera work and lighting and different angles and obstruction of things or exposure to others. You're talking about words that are being written for these characters who you've started writing from day one.
There is one attempt at a physical altercation, and it was one that actually shocked me a little bit because Gordon goes for Cameron.
Yes.
And we've got a lot of negative thoughts about Gordon, like plenty of like negative thoughts
Plenty.
about Gordon,
Yeah.
but I don't think of him as someone who's violent. And I don't think of him as somebody who's violent to women. Like in his passive aggressiveness maybe, but not physically.
No.
Um and it's an interesting kind of insight both into Gordon and what drives him, what really drives him to distraction. Like a million things have happened at home, but it's not until the work could be lost that he absolutely loses it. It's also really interesting in his view of Cameron because you're like, I don't think, and I know it's his wife, but I don't think for a minute that Gordon would go for Donna in the same way.
Or the girls.
Or the girl, and so you're like, what the hell is going on in this relationship that he actually physically goes for her? And it's genuinely shocking because, like you say, so much of what happens in the show is about people having a war of words or a war of theories or a war of technology that you can and can't see. And then this is like really brief, but quite shocking, like physical move towards her, which I like. It genuinely made me taken aback.
I think Gordon has middle child syndrome, and I think he feels so left out. Like we saw it in the previous episode, where he's almost shocked to see, like almost shocked and delighted, like, how's he going? Like, how are you getting on? And she ignores him, takes his soda, walks right back into the dungeon, and he is so left out that he explodes. And the thing is, lesson learned, because she needed to learn this lesson. She needed to understand that. And we draw the parallels back again to like being in a corporate structure where you're not in your garage playing around with some code. You are in a corporate environment where you are getting paid your paycheck that you used to have strangers crash a hotel room to do your work. And of course, we do not agree with Joe being the manipulator, the puppet master, and actually the way that he jumping on Joe for a second tells people like, "Oh my God, there's an a journalist that picked up our story," and then you go into the office and it's just like, "Mate, I'm only here as a favor. Like, let's just get this shit out of the way. I flew all the way here."
So I have many thoughts about this journalist, which will not surprise you, because if we're looking at this, like, first of all, we talked about the importance of words here. I've also said that I feel like Donna might be a proxy for writers everywhere who are like, I gave you this damn story, and then you do all your flashy shit on top of it, and the actors get all the accolades, but I gave you the story because I wrote it. And then we have a journalist. Writers love to write a journalist. They have very complicated feelings about journalists. Many of them have been them. And we've got this guy who is presented, I think, not well. I think it's an incomplete picture, because in this guy comes, and first he's supposed to be kind of a lazy dickhead, and you're like, really, would a journalist like
Actively
admit
fly.
to being this much of a dick, like actively be this much of a dick about everything, as opposed to like maybe just seeing him in his hotel room being like, yeah, whatever. That seems odd that he's going up against Joe, like it's for no particular gain of his, but fine, maybe he's just a little bit of an ass, who knows. But
Well,
then
and
he talks to
more
Boz.
mystery around who Joe is, right?
Sure. Then he talks to Boz, who he's known for what? Maximum, what, a few hours?
Yeah.
And he divines Boz's entire insight, his whole place in the pecking order. Like he makes this needling little speech, basically and if Boz is the one that orchestrates the beating later, maybe this is the inciting incident more than Nathan. Like some outsider has spotted Boz's weakness in the food chain, which almost feels like a bit of a like Aaron Sorkin moment of like, this person has come in from the outside and a Republican has seen the
Yeah.
crack in your Democrat armor. It's
Yeah.
like this kind of, it's like bad end of Sorkin stuff. But then the same guy can't see that he's being manipulated by Joe, with whom he actually has an indirect history. So you're like, is this guy brilliant? Is he an idiot? Is like I don't feel like I have any
No.
sense of the character of this journalist at all, other than the fact that he's again a bit of a toddler.
He is. He's a petulant child, and that is exactly my problem with a lot of the way that, I mean, especially like American journalists, and no offense to anyone here, but who might be listening and find themselves in the bucket of being American journalists. But the reality is that the journalist plays the role of the moral compass a lot of the times and plays around with the ethics of things. Around like, I'm running it anyway. You can have it this way or that way, but I'm running it. That's that kind of like journalistic. I've got to do what's right, which, by the way, if anyone has watched or hasn't seen the morning show yet, for all of its flaws, it's a very interesting dynamic around what the news is and what that fake smile in front of the camera is versus the actual world happening that you're documenting around you. And I look back into that show around.
It's the classic tension.
Yeah.
It's the classic tension between the public interest and what the public are interested in.
But
Like,
the journalists, just like and actually in today's world, accelerated and empowered by social media, thinks that their opinion on the world is more absolute, maybe because they're telling a story and people are listening, right? It's not objective anymore.
I'm not sure it ever could or has been, in the sense that it is both impossible and possibly undesirable to have people go into this to just report facts as if there's no context and no emotion and no feeling.
Sure.
Like, this is why we have to have things that are left leaning and right leaning and all the rest of it. And somewhere in the middle of it, we will find a nuanced truth. But like, we're all going to read it the way that we want to read it anyway.
For all we know, everyone that he's bringing in is like his high school buddies who he's got a rivalry with. He wants to show off his new toy. I mean, and the fact that
And look, we had plenty of first impressions of Joe that were like, oh, hey, another privileged white guy doing his privileged white guy thing. And yes, I know that it's the 80s and they probably won't put it in that phrasing, but maybe this guy just feels like he's seen one too many guys like
well,
Joe.
I actually think that Joe without defending any of that sort of that using that filter, I do think that at least that privilege doesn't, like, he's still using it to empower other people to an extent. Like, he's like, I've got these contacts, I got these connections, and I want to make this thing, and I want to bring you along. It's not a sense of like, but there is the element of like, I can get whatever I want, and my upbringing has been throughout this and that. But what I was getting at with the journalist is that, I mean, I agree with you. I felt like he was flat, very two dimensional. I think that we are seeing this pattern with guest stars on the show, whether they're known or not. The
Mm.
writers don't care about why they're there. They won't develop them. Okay. And Debbie, the secretary, is also in this episode, which again didn't remember her being more than a prop for a couple of lines in the first couple of two. And Joe is trying to convince Cameron to leave the office, which I never took as a, ooh, Joe is going to mingle here. I took it as like, Joe thinks that she really just needs to go and take a fucking shower.
The creepy line about him, like, get her to wear a bra. It was like, full body cringe. So full marks to the writing for getting that whole creepy vibe across. Well done.
But also Joe saying like, do you think I could go tell her to put a bra on? Like, that kind of like pushing it to the next level, I really enjoy, because I think Joe kind of enjoys pushing people's buttons.
Yeah, he's manipulating Cameron into the story.
Yeah.
And he's doing it through another woman. And it's like, it's a very good encapsulation of Joe right there.
And so Debbie, who is another guest star with a minor role, has that purpose there that transcends episodes. And I'm not saying she's three-dimensional by any stretch of the imagination, but she has proven to be like a underrated player that at least helps show why women or whatever are in that, sorry, why women may be in a certain position, or how they're perceived in that era. But this journalist comes in, classic white journalist with like with a chip on his shoulder, like, I'm gonna get this story, and if it's gonna be trash, it'll be trash, and it'll have my name on it. And if it's not trash, I also get something out of it. I'm not gonna help you. I'm not, which I agree. Like, why would he help anyone there? But his lack of sympathy really just helps show the landscape in that era. And we've seen it when all the advertisers pulled out on episode 2. It's like, it's IBM or nothing. It's like there's a huge monopoly going around. And if Joe can get someone he knows indirectly involved in a positive way, how are these characters meant to sort of continue? And he did follow everyone around, and I was surprised that Joe allowed that. He wasn't even worried. It was the same IBM situation of, this could go really badly. He was even hiding it. I also didn't like, from a script point of view, when he was like, but look, Cameron's a woman. It's like, maybe in that instance it had to be pointed out because it was that cheap shot. But it's kind of like, really, you managed to get this far with reference points rather than really have to spell it out. And you're saying she's a woman.
I allowed it because he was manipulating the fact,
rather than a discussion with boss saying like, oh, but she's a woman, do we want to hire her? Yeah, I get you.
Yeah. It wasn't. I allowed it because it was self-aware in a way that, like I say, I still think that there were good intentions behind the Donna Cameron scene, but it just felt really, really awkward.
Now, it is interesting that Joe keeps getting bailed out of things, right? He like trashes that stereo store and walks out, and nothing happens. He gets, he's put in jail, obviously not by his own doing, but he gets bailed out. IBM comes and goes, you don't, here's your check, but I've done 2 million worth of damage, doesn't matter. So are we being told that this is going to go on until it can't, and then something is going to explode? Because I'm all in for that. I feel like that is something that the show will, if it's leading up to that, I feel like it's going to be glorious. Because when Joe really loses it, I think that's going to be like the pinnacle of what the show can do as far as how far we've gotten.
So it's not just about, I think, if Joe loses it, because he's done that a few times now, but whether he can continue doing so without any consequences. So I don't know. And honestly, I can't remember whether the show is building up to tell us that there is a line that Joe can't cross, or if he crosses it, he won't get help, or whether it's, guys like this, they can keep crossing lines and the world keeps letting them. The world keeps getting out of the way for them. And remembering that he is a proxy for a Steve Jobs or a Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg or whoever it is. It's like we're seeing in the real world now. And yes, the show was in I think it's 2014 at this point, and not all of the stuff that we've seen in recent years has come out yet. But we already had a sense that some of these tech figures were like reworking the landscape of what is and isn't okay morally, and what is and isn't okay in terms of privacy and in terms of interaction. Like they're remodeling the way that we talk to each other. And now Facebook's right now having this issue with advertisers pulling out, and kind of what that means in the longer term sense for the way that we communicate online. And if Joe is that figure at that point in 2014, are the writers saying at some point even these guys have to hit a wall, or are they saying no matter what these guys do, we keep getting out of the way for them? And the only way we're going to know is if we carry on watching. But it's a really interesting proposition that even after he takes this humiliating, horrific beating,
Yeah.
even then there's still somebody to help him back up again and get him out of that again. And you don't know whether it's the very person that delivered the beating or not.
Yeah, but this is the strength of the show, is that Boss needs Joe as much as Joe needs Boss, because of these relationships built on sort of each other's toes. Like Boss has been in the company for over 20 years. I mean, Nathan says it. Like he says it to Nathan. He goes, like, come on, like, me, I've been doing this. And he's just like, yeah, but like, who's running this? Like things changed suddenly. And not only did this uh things change, you brought him in, he pulled the rug from under you. So who is in, not only is it a question of who is in charge, but rather how is this dependency going to evolve? And again, we're discovering the same thing being Cameron and Donna. We are discovering the same thing. I mean, we've seen the same thing be obviously Donna and Gordon, because they're married and they require a different level of partnership. But even Donna and Joe, in this level of secrecy, have suddenly built this dependency of not only what you tell him, but can I trust you? And we find out that Donna does tell him, but Gordon's reaction is not what she expects. So
Gordon's reaction is priceless, and then her reaction to his reaction is amazing, because he's like, "Oh wow, did it work?"
and I think Donna's like, I
And the
lost
funny
him.
thing is that just before he says it, you almost hear it in your head. You're like, "Oh my god, that's what he's gonna ask." Like, you almost realize that's gonna happen, and I think that you've hit on something absolutely true there. Like, I think you've nailed it. In the last episode was about pecking order and getting in, who's in charge of who. This episode is who needs who. Who is dependent on who and for what? So, when Cameron works out that Joe is lying about his scars, he doesn't ask him not to tell anyone. He doesn't ask her, sorry, not to tell anyone. He just sort of says, "Is that right?" And he looks smug about it. Perhaps because he thinks he knows Cameron already and she's not going to say it because she came to him to reveal it. She didn't just spread it around. But, it sort of doesn't bother him too much. When Donna reveals this sleight of hand, he actually asks her not to tell people. And your question there is, now, does he care about Gordon knowing, because Gordon might leave and put the project in jeopardy? Even though I think we all know that Gordon's not going to go anywhere when he's got the whiff of something that he wants to do in his hands. He's going to keep like pulling on that. But does he care? Does he care what Gordon thinks of him? And if he does care what Gordon thinks of him, is it in a personal way of like, I am beginning to build a relationship with this person? Or is it, oh, if Gordon thinks less of me, I will have more trouble controlling him? Or is it all of these things? It's interesting that for the first time he actually cares. Unless the whole thing is him testing Donna to see whether it comes back to him or not. Like, can I trust her? If I ask her not to say anything, am I going to hear about it again?
It could very well be this constant wheel spinning, and that's what makes it so appealing. Like, we are watching a show that's drama, and I feel like this is I feel like it's not soapy. I hope that everyone has stuck around. If you're listening to us, it means that you're interested in the show and that you're watching beyond episode 3. And I think some of these elements are going to be really interesting to peel out. And to your point about Joe and Gordon, and what he thinks of him or doesn't think of him, we know why Gordon is sort of enamored with Joe and why he wants to continue building this thing. He's been given free, to an extent, free reign. Not free reign, actually. He's been given like a limited reign that he's comfortable with, because it's like, here's the sandbox, go play in it with your geeks. And Joe, does he need Gordon from like an engineering point of view? Because Donna is certainly in the picture. Cameron is certainly, let's just say, capable. Gordon was sort of like a way into Cardiff Electric in a way, right? So he killed two birds with one stone. And I'm not saying that he doesn't need him, but I do wonder what Joe thinks Gordon's biggest asset is, and what's gonna happen when they build this thing. Do they all get dumped?
I do feel like he does specifically and like, well, that is a big question, and we should come back to that. I do feel like he does need Gordon
Right.
specifically. He needs somebody who cares about engineering because Cameron doesn't. She recognizes that she needs it to do her job, but she has no interest in doing it and, like, doesn't care about the package at all. But he also like, it's very clear he's not very interested in working with Donna. Like, he accepts her into the fold for this one-off because she saves his ass and makes the story that he wants to be told. Um, but, I mean, I think he assumed
No.
that Gordon was gonna fix the problem. I don't think he necessarily foresaw that Gordon was gonna bring his wife in to fix it. But whatever, he doesn't really care. Someone fixed it, it looks good. If it's gotta be Donna this time, then fine. Um, but the way that he and Donna square off and do nothing to be gentle or mitigating or charming to each other whatsoever, they are just their most ambitious and unpleasant selves to each other. Um, it just sort of indicates that he needs an engineer that he can mold and control. Like, he has influence over Gordon's behavior. I think he knows. I mean, I certainly got the distinct impression as a viewer that there was very little Joe could do to influence Donna except
Yeah.
through Gordon. He can influence Gordon and Gordon can influence Donna, but Joe cannot ask Donna to do anything without her basically sticking 2 fingers up and being like, "Yeah, mate, I've had enough of I've had enough of men, and you are not one that I have to deal with." So,
Yeah, I love that. Actually, that scene in the end is a parallel to the Cameron scene where she's calling him out on the Sputnik year that it went up.
but Cameron, who's so aggressive, calls him out so gently. And Donna, who we've seen as like the mother and the housewife and the employee who has to defer to her boss, who also used to be her friend, who also maybe used to have a thing for her. You know, she's had to be subservient in so many of these roles. It's just like, you, my friend, are full of shit. And she just doesn't like it's the one person where she has total permission to just be Donna. And that like I want to see more of that Donna.
I want to see more of that dynamic. And this is when we talked about back in our first recording episode, talking about how, if you really stick things out, and this is not giving spoilers, but the writers really do figure out how these characters work best together and against each other. And that's why the show becomes such a gem, because of these relationships. That scene was also, again, going back to the lighting for a second, very dark, very close up shots. Things, it was a confrontation, like sort of almost from like a close-up point of view, like side by side, like head on almost. Sorry, I know that didn't make a lot of sense, but you know exactly what I mean. And so
We're
I
testing if you've watched it now.
Yeah, exactly. So if you were able to follow along, great. If not, then just get another cup of coffee. It'll fit right in. Um, I'm really looking forward to seeing where that ends up and where it takes the story. We didn't talk about some of the other symbolism elements, but the episode literally starts with a motherboard sunk in a fish tank, which is like obviously very smart. And as someone that loves technology, I can tell you, like, great. I mean, I'm not an engineer, guys, but great solution to like, let's test the chip before it comes out, knowing it's gonna be that with this, but also like interesting analogy of like the fish tank and like things inside of water that may explode at any moment because you're pushing them too hard. So that's an interesting one.
But also the fishbowl is such a classic way of the journalist is coming in and he's observing the fishbowl, right? They're all on show to him while they're swimming around in their natural environment, and he is literally the fish out of water, watching them all. And I mean, there's a device in The West Wing where CJ has a fish on her desk, right? She gets given the fish by a journalist, but this fishbowl on the desk, there was a classic thing that the props people used to do of putting different props in the fishbowl to
Oh,
represent the episode. So sometimes it would
nice.
be like her press secretary's podium and things like that. And it's just it's like a clever little visual, like, oh, hey, here she is, the press secretary. Like the ultimate fishbowl is the White House, right? We're all watching from the outside, trying to work out what the hell's going on in there while things go round and round in circles. And it felt like the fish tank was another bit of the now classic Halt and Catch Fire, like deliberate symbolism. I kind of I should be like, oh my god, they're laying it on so thick, but I love it. I love that they just double down on it and they're like, we're gonna have a fishbowl, we're gonna have people shooting horses and knowing and setting it up on purpose as symbolism within symbolism.
We're gonna
We're,
have
we're,
fire.
we're
We're
gonna
gonna
have a
have
noose and
fire
an
in an
exit sign and
office.
fire.
But the thing is, this is
It's amazing. They're just so generous with it.
well, I love it. I love it, and I haven't been watching many films lately, but I did see Lost in Translation a couple of weeks ago, and I told you about this because I was texting you um, live reactions of like, wait, what? No, I don't like this, or actually, that's pretty cool, and the cinematic approach to like heavy symbolism through all devices is still there, and I feel like this show is able to capitalize on that kind of visual language and narrative structure that I think it works. And why not? And actually, interesting bit about Lost in Translation in relation to Halt and Catch Fire. Who knew? But one of the things that and me and you both love Tokyo, and I've been there 3 times. I went this year in
Mm.
January, and I was surprised at how little Tokyo you actually get to see because it all takes place in that hotel. And Halt and Catch Fire has the tendency of sticking to just 2 or 3 locations as well. And again, making the most out of those, telling the story from repurposing those spaces and really giving them that meaning of like, this is the office and this is what it means. And I don't need to show you, yeah, you do go to the ranch and other places, but again, I'm not going to show you like a new bit of the city so you can get a feel for Silicon Valley. No, you're going to get the feel of it from being right in the thick of it. So interesting sort of comparison to get to the point of um, symbolism as a way of repurposing a space, repurposing a scene, and reigniting characters. I thought it was interesting for Joe to set fire to the binder. And everyone was like, whoa, the binder, the binder. Like, you couldn't forget that the binder was like a legal binding thing that they couldn't get rid of. And another the binder for me burning the burning of the binder um, was the in conjunction with I got a journalist coming and boss reacting to both. So it's like, are you are you sort of like preempting stuff and getting a little bit ahead of yourself with this stuff, um, or are you that blindly confident not in others but in your own skill set to maneuver and and influence and manipulate that you love this showman stuff to like continue helping yourself sleep at night.
Honestly, when he did that, part of me was like, I don't remember this bit. Is it even the real binder? And I think it is actually. I don't think it ever gets undermined by saying actually he just burnt a load of scrap paper. But I sort of wouldn't have been surprised if it had turned out to just be a load of printouts that he burnt to make it look like the binder to just take everybody with him, because we know by now that Joe will set up the appearance of things over and over again. Like Joe only really cares about the appearance of things. That's why he wants Cameron to go take a shower and put a bra
Yeah.
on. That's why he,
Yeah.
wants things to he wants to set up speeches in a certain way and gets annoyed with Gordon when he delivers the wrong line at the wrong time. All Joe really cares about is creating a vision. His own flat that we see very, very little, but it's so Spartan, it's so bare. Like he doesn't want to create a personality. He doesn't want to show any of himself. He's so locked down because it's all about appearances. Um, And yeah, it's just this kind of it's such a big moment for everyone in that office, and then you sort of forget about
Yeah,
it in the whole
yeah.
cavalcade of stuff that comes after
But
that.
I kind of feel like that's part of Joe's sort of magic, that he orchestrates these things and sort of steps back, and then things happen. Now, I do wish there was more interaction. So, like we said, it feels like he's getting further and further away from everyone. Although, again, that Donna scene was great. Another thing this episode gave us was some level of resolution for Gordon and Donna when they're working together and sort of being reminded of what they worked on before, sort of, and what they can achieve together. I feel like that's actually like a smaller silver lining in this episode, and it actually sets him up in a way that makes him stronger. And again, even though he reacts differently to the news that she delivers in terms of Joe's secret, I think that moment is going to be something that helps them stick through other stuff, because we also don't, again, we're the show has a habit of like throwing a problem and fixing it, and then throwing another problem and fixing it. And I think, and I like that approach, because we don't want there to be, if you think back of like episode 1 or 2, when we didn't know whether, it was episode 2 where we didn't know whether um, Donna thought Cameron was a man and he didn't say anything, and that got nipped in the bud. It's like, we don't want that to continue to a point where these characters are being set up to sort of be like, uh, are they going to be together by the end of it? Is this going to break them apart? Like, obviously, that is an element of everyone's lives could continue or not in the way that they are. But I don't know. There's just something to be said about them, the writers, like protecting this unity that is their marriage and what they built, and not just destroying it for the sake of, you're pushing me too hard. And because that's also what marriage is meant to be. And obviously, I'm not married. You are, so you tell me if that's true or not. But
I have never built a symphonic with my husband, and I think perhaps it is wise that we never do. But yeah, no, it's their relationship really comes to life when it's about the work, and you get the distinct impression that the work is what brought them together, because now you have it confirmed that Donna did have a hand in this whole, like, symphonic stuff. Like, she obviously was part of it because she clearly knows what she's doing, and she wasn't just a bystander, and it wasn't just that, she came from a family with money or whatever. Um, and you get this sense that since Gordon failed in that work, he has also failed in his house. He's failed as a father because he's not always there, and when he is there, he gets drunk and ends up in the drunk tank, and, just he has to be fulfilled at work in order to be fulfilled at home. And we know that Donna is keeping home running at the cost of her work. Like, her work is the price, like, not being as good at her work as she should be is the price that she's paying for keeping home from sinking. And so there's this, ooh, this is interesting that, they really have their best moments when they're on the same page, and they're on the same page more when it's about work. And so now you know that Donna's got to go back to TI. You know that she doesn't work for Cardiff, and she's kind of done this one-off thing on this project, and now she has to go, pick up the car keys and go back home.
she can't be
But you
Susan.
also know it. Yeah, she gives Gordon an out, really, by telling him Joe's story. She gives him an opportunity to say, "Oh, man, I don't like this guy. I don't wanna work with him." And Gordon, of course, doesn't, and it's predictable, and she rolls her eyes and walks out. But
Yeah.
now you're like, "Well, what scenario are they gonna come up with that lets these 2 characters work together again?" Because it really feels like the overall long-term success of their marriage is dependent on them being able to find projects that excite them both, because, like, they're not getting any fulfillment, either of them. Like, that is the one thing Donna and Gordon clearly have in common, is neither of them are completely happy unless they're doing work that excites them.
Well, actually, just thinking through what you're saying, I kind of like them. I kind of like this sort of both being artists dynamic, and they sort of like feel each other's. I don't know. Like, again, their love for this kind of work is what makes them sort of artist-like.
Creativity, I
And
guess.
and
Yeah.
well, when she tells Cameron that her code is like a piece of music, again, it's another reference to them all being sort of artists, except Joe, because he gets ousted a lot as not being part of, someone that understands what's going on.
Joe is an art critic, an art admirer.
Yeah,
An art buyer, but he cannot produce anything.
A buyer for someone else, even, but he cannot produce it. And so I do actually like these characters sort of being positioned as like modern day artists, where you know, coding, as we know, is probably the best skill set that anyone can know right now. And we're, imagine back then. And I think, and to the level that they're doing it. So I do kind of like those references. And, like a lot of times art can't be understood by everyone, both in terms of creation and output. So, yeah, I don't know. I just kind of really like that sort of more romantic side of that metaphor. And before we wrap things up, we were discussing what the title means for this episode. It's obviously a line that Cameron says. She tells Donna, "Have you ever been this close to the metal?" Obviously, Cameron's very sort of punk rock, so that analogy applies there. But to me, it's this sort of flying too close to the sun type scenario. Because we also see it with Joe again, and what I mentioned of him, like maybe calling things too early in terms of getting a piece written about them, or bringing this journalist in, or even experimenting with ruining Cameron's bios so early in the process. What do you think about what the title could mean?
I would definitely agree that there is a definite. I mean, Cameron has an outright Icarus moment, doesn't she? Her overconfidence
Yeah.
leads to her not storing her backups. Like, she can believe that she did it herself because she wasn't being that careful. Like, Donna does say, look, she is she is a little bit, she cuts corners, but she's not sloppy.
No.
Like, enough to just not
She's
use
smart.
clean discs
She
or
works
whatever.
smart.
That's how Donna realizes
Yeah.
it. She works smart, but she still believes that she could have screwed up because she wasn't storing the discs far away enough. She wasn't backing up as often as she could have. All that stuff is a little bit of hubris. She just basically is so bound up in what she's doing that she doesn't feel like she needs to take all the steps that an ordinary person would
Right.
take. And there's definitely an Icarus element to that. Yeah, I think that was a really good, because I didn't really think of that, and then when you said it, I was like, yes, like definite light bulb moment there.
Very, very last thing for me is Cameron's T-shirt. Ignore alien orders. Amazing. True. Who are the aliens?
Beautiful.
Oh, man. So that's it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back next week to get stuck into episode 5, Adventure. In the meantime, come and join us on Twitter at TTTGYTTT. Just pretend you're typing this as the old computer codes to get more money in The Sims or something like that. So try and find us, and if you have any issues, let us know. Think about it, and please share your thoughts, questions, and comments.
Even better, subscribe to this podcast on your podcast app of choice, and you'll never miss an episode. And we won't have to guess whether we're being fired or not.